Welcome back. You're here with Goldberg. Today we'll be talking about Soviet Afghanistan and the tragedy that it was. Some will go, who cares about that? Exactly. That's why we see the headlines today. Because humans, instead of learning from the past, cooperating with one another, having a long-term view, would prefer to erect a meat grinder every 10 to 20 years and say, oh, I've got the moral primacy in this case. What can you do? Now, this particular video, I'm going to give you something of a spark notes when it comes to Afghan history because I want to focus on the Soviet period more directly. But suffice to say, it has always been an unruly territory to govern. Part of that is due to the geography, but also the complex nexus of ethnic, tribal, and religious politics. You've got the Pashtuns, who have historically dominated Afghan civil affairs, and when Pakistan was created, they actually separated much of the Pashtun population. So it should come as no surprise, Pakistan readily meddles in Afghan politics and internal security. But apart from the Pashtuns, you've also got Hazaras, who speak a dialect of Persian, and then Tajiks, some Uzbeks, others are going to tossed in for good measure. Islam never makes things easy, as we well know. As part of the Great Game, which was an event that took place, it was a struggle between primarily the UK and Russia for dominance over Afghanistan. They were looking for resources on the one hand, but probably more so overall strategic buffer, because Afghanistan is very close to what was at one time the Russian Empire and then later the Soviet Union. But in the 1930s, Zahir Shah comes to power, and he rules for almost 40 years on the dot, give or take a few months or weeks, until 1973. Shah is not a Western puppet. If you hear some libertarian or communist or fundamentalist Muslim imbecile claim that all these monarchs were just being controlled by the West, that is untrue. He was very much in favor and did push through in the way of education developments. But Afghanistan is a primitive country. You can't rule from the center that effectively. You have to maintain these complex networks that we just discussed between the clans and ethnic groups, the religious authorities. But he was not doing a terrible job. It's just you're vulnerable because you can, kind of like what happened in Cuba, that the central government in Havana didn't know what was going on outside of the city, outside of the metropolitan region. But with all that being said, he kind of like Mohammad Reza, who we've talked about before, he is removed in a coup, but not necessarily right away by the Wahhabi types or the Shia radicals in the case of Iran. We have Mohammed Daud or Dawood Khan, who is a military leader. He establishes a semi-secular Republic of Afghanistan that lasts a few years, and he attempted to play the Soviets off of the Americans, which was very popular by non-aligned movements such as Tito in Yugoslavia, because they figured they didn't want to be an exact satellite, but you can get aid and cooperation from both sides. He's a somewhat effective leader, but he does not have the strongest power base outside of the military. And as things happen, he is also targeted in a coup attempt in the 1970s by our man Nur Muhammad Taraki. Taraki was a longtime leader of the Afghan Democratic Party, which was a Marxist-Leninist organization, although that's a little bit too much of a simplification. He's a journalist, he's on the older side. He comes to power but doesn't last very long because he very rapidly unleashes waves of reform, which is common for communists. Within that Afghan Democratic Party, you have two primary factions. So you have the Hulkist, which is the People's Faction, that is somewhat more attuned. I don't want to throw the term to Stalin, but basically it was a maximalist socialist. Get it done, don't hold back, don't do it with any degree of entryism or gradualism. And on the other hand, you have the Pacharmist or the Banner faction, which was about that slower pace, trying to keep in mind that you've got a very primitive, very traditional culture and you can alienate people. This is something that Taraki's minions screwed up on because they were too zealous, and so they pissed off many of the conservative Afghans by trying to interfere in traditional ceremonies, trying to empower women faster than would have been ideal in the eyes of a lot of these leaders. Taraki has an effective working relationship with a Russian Soviet Politburo, and they don't want him removed, at least not right away.
he is warned by a number of advisors that his number two man, his deputy Hazibullah Amin, the guy in the center, is plotting to take him out of power, but he doesn't really act until it's too late, and he ends up being suffocated to death with a pillow, if I'm correct, by Hazibullah's followers. Hazibullah unleashes a pretty aggressive campaign. He was a more effective administrator, but he was not well liked, and there were questions amongst the Soviets whether they could trust him or he would try to do his own kind of Daud Khan thing, break off and be more independent. Because as much as the Soviets might have spoke, they wanted a degree of independence, they also don't want rogue states running around doing whichever. And this leads to a decision. And was kind of, there was a lot of miscommunication. Soviet advisors, KGB agents, they weren't certain if they were supposed to actually support Amin or poison him. Some of them got killed as the Soviets moved into Afghanistan, ostensibly to stabilize the situation and take out Amin. That happens. This is going to be towards the end of the 1970s. These first two communist leaders really didn't last long at all. And so Amin is killed. He's replaced by the guy on the far right, although LOL, more to the left, Babrak Harmal. Harmal is one of the longer serving communist leaders. He's officially on the banner, the more moderate side, although to be perfectly real, when we're dealing with this type of society and you're trying to attain large scale social reform, you have to use harsh internal security methods. And that's exactly what was happening. As other powers are watching this, you have in Pakistan General Zia al Huk, if I'm correct pronouncing that. He was not a radical Muslim, but he did use radical Muslims for political reasons. So he starts funding rebels with weaponry. He coordinates at some points, his government ISI, his intelligence services coordinates with the Chia seeds, our very own Chia seeds, to distribute radicalization propaganda, Qurans, translated in a language that will be able to gin up many of these fundamentalists against the communist government.
In addition to Zia, you have the Saudi government, because you have to remember what's going on politically in the Middle East. Mohammed Pahlavi was removed towards the end of the 1970s as Shah of Iran by radicals. So the Saudis start freaking out. Saudi Arabia was not as much of a fundamentalist society until that occurred. And they said, all right, we better adopt these radicalization policies on the home front to keep the Arab cells, the Muslim cells content, and then we'll start funding and exporting it to other countries. And they've been doing it for a long time. In fact, the Saudis were funding the people who were mass murdering Christians in the Balkans in the 1990s. You've never heard about that, of course, because America was siding with another power at the time. And that's a subject perhaps for a different video. Much of the responsibility as far as the chia seed operation goes at the foot of Bill Casey, who was something of a loose cannon. He was in the Cleon Skousen side of the anti-communist front where, the only good Russian is a dead Russian. We got to fight communism no matter what the cost. He authorized and approved funding of mujahideens using car bombs. He helped bring a bunch of Stinger missiles, which, while I don't want to claim, given the influence of Pakistan and the Saudis, that, it was inevitable just because of the US, but if we haven't given them those rockets and they hadn't gotten elsewhere, that was the main reason why the Mujahideen even stood a chance against Soviet air power, is because of those missiles. So he did a lot of stuff that was shady, broke the law repeatedly, and then he ended up dying, I think, from a brain tumor or something. So, interesting character, radical anti communist Catholic, in my view, quite short sighted. And in fairness to him, though, you have to think of the mindset people had at the time. The Soviet Union is still in operation, but I feel that it was very much a short sighted move, to be perfectly frank. And I don't think we have fully recovered from it. I don't think the world has. Many of the problems that germinated because of these anti communist policies have just been absolutely disastrous still to this present day. And so we come to this gentleman, Dr. Mohammed Najibullah. Najibullah was a functionary who came up in the ranks of the communist secret police in Afghanistan. He was an extremely capable administrator and organizer, and he's the main reason why the Soviet regime did not super rapidly collapse. Because you have to recall, in the late 1980s, what's happening? The Soviet Union is beginning to unravel under Gorbachev. Even though Gorbachev has been probably unfairly cast as the guy who was trying to destroy the Soviets, when in reality he just wanted to make it a more competitive economic and political power. But he starts signaling we're going to withdraw troops, potentially funding, and yet he tries to cooperate with George Shultz, American Secretary of State, and say, let's do this intelligently. Take back the weaponry. Don't leave all these radicals with a bunch of the ability to do damage. And you're going to bring about this fundamentalist regime afterwards. But the Chia Seeds don't really care. Elamau, you're a communist. Suck it. So, as the Soviet troops withdraw, which Najibullah opposed, understandably, nevertheless, Soviet funds continue flowing in, and Najibullah did a pretty effective job of strengthening the military, building up the security service. I think at one point it had 30,000 employees, and that's why there was no American style, was it 2021, abject collapse of Kabul. They held on for quite a long period of time. And that was because the Mujahideen were not that competent. You've heard this thing about, oh, Sheikh Massoud, yeah, he was this great leader. He had his moments, but he really was not nearly as militarily effective. And Najibullah was very much trying. Now, as he sees that he's not going to be able to rely on Soviet support, he attempts to do almost precisely what America spent 20 years doing. He says national reconciliation, multi-party democracy. We don't have to be a strictly communist state. Let's try to get things working. Well, the problem is the Chia Seeds don't want to play ball. You also have a gentleman by the name of, we're going to call him Hekratyar. That's probably a mispronunciation, but he was an extremely radical guy. He refused to cooperate. And you hear, oh, Najibullah, he's the butcher of Kabul. Whenever you hear those type of descriptors applied to anyone who's not in line with soy democracy, you always have to scratch your head. Once more, you're dealing with a very primitive society, and they respond to force, strength. They do not respect pieces of paper and appeals to rights and legitimacy. But as it happens, Najibullah is able to hold on into the 90s for a tad, then he's driven out of power. He stays in a UN compound for a few years and does request support from the Chia Seeds to be able to leave the country. They say, Ailamau, you're a communist, suck it. He ends up being brutalized, shot, and then hung along with his brother in 1996. So that was the saga simplified of the Soviet Afghan experiments. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, as I just noted, in terms of the national reconciliation, we spent so much time and so much money trying to kill Russians. And then about, if you want to talk about from the fall of Kabul, so the early 90s to 2001, we're back there and we're trying to do the exact same thing. Instead of just letting the Soviets, which they still would have faced resistance, but just let them establish more stable long-term institutions, take care of some of the Muslim cells, take care of the people that will just never be able to function. And even if the Soviets had still not been successful, I suspect Afghanistan would be a much better country today. Whereas now you have, oh, you're back to the Taliban. Well, I mean, maybe the Taliban, they have reduced poppy production or opium production, but now they're saying other drugs are probably going to replace it in a black market, because that's much of what the agricultural industry is about, that part of the world. So we will leave you with this video. Hopefully the audio is substantial enough with the OBS.
Americans, and you should help the people of Afghanistan to live in a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous society, instead of waging a perpetual war against each other. Your tax dollars could be spent for a more human and useful cause. As a great country, the rule of the United States could be very significant in the future developments of our country.
So, yeah, takeaway is try to learn from the past and don't be so ideologically hard-headed that you can't realize some problems you need to cooperate on, instead of assuming, oh, we don't like you, therefore we'll go for whoever's your enemy, no matter how destructive, the long term consequences may happen to be.